That single thought captures what philosophers call the problem of divine hiddenness. It's the tension between the claim that an all-powerful, all-loving God exists and the reality that millions of people search for such a God and come up empty-handed. If a being truly wanted a relationship with us, wanted us to know it, love it, and trust it, the most basic expectation is that this being would not hide. At the very least, it would make its presence known in a way that doesn't rely on old texts, secondhand stories, or rituals handed down from generations who themselves had no direct proof. The problem is not just that we don't see a God standing in the clouds or speaking in a clear voice. It's that many people spend years of their lives, sometimes decades, reaching out through prayer, searching through sacred texts, attending services, following rules, asking, pleading, and yet feel nothing in return. Not just atheists, but believers too, who struggle with silence where they expect presence. Think about how human relationships work. If a parent loves their child, that parent doesn't stay silent for decades, leaving the child to guess whether they exist at all. If a partner wants trust and commitment, they don't vanish into the shadows and leave behind only confusing letters from strangers claiming to speak on their behalf. Love shows itself. Care reveals itself. Presence makes itself known. So when we're told that God loves every person deeply and personally, the silence begins to look strange. Why would the creator of the universe play the role of a distant figure whose existence is debated endlessly rather than simply showing up? Some religious thinkers respond by saying that God is hidden because faith must be tested, or that belief without evidence is more meaningful. But that idea has serious problems. If a love is supposed to be central, why make people suffer through doubt, despair, and confusion? What kind of parent demands a child's trust without ever proving that they are there to begin with? This problem of divine hiddenness is not some abstract puzzle locked in philosophy classrooms. It's real in the lives of countless people. Former believers often describe years of praying with sincerity, receiving nothing but silence. Entire support groups exist for people who struggled with unanswered prayers, waiting for some sign that never came. These aren't stories of casual curiosity. They are stories of deep longing and genuine searching. Some theologians try to explain this by saying that God's ways are mysterious, or that we cannot know the reasons for divine silence. But those kinds of answers only push the problem further back. If the ultimate goal is relationship, why design the world in a way that makes absence the default experience? Philosopher J.L. Schellenberg developed this argument into a formal challenge to theism. He asked us to consider the idea of a perfectly loving being. A perfectly loving being, by definition, would not withhold itself from anyone who genuinely seeks it, because real love is not about hiding, it's about openness. Schellenberg pointed out that there are many non-resistant non-believers, people who do not believe, not because they hate the idea of God or because they're stubborn, but because they sincerely searched and found nothing. Their existence is strong evidence against the idea of a God who loves everyone equally and wants a relationship with them. Some try to say that hiddenness is necessary for free will, but free will does not depend on hiddenness. We don't lose our freedom when we know that other people exist. We don't lose our capacity for choice when the presence of loved ones is certain. If God were obvious, people would still be free to love or reject, just as we are free to love or reject each other. And yet the silence remains. When we look at the world honestly, what we find is not overwhelming evidence of divine presence, but overwhelming evidence of absence. The silence is so consistent that people have had to invent entire systems of theology to justify why the silence exists at all. That in itself is telling. If the evidence were clear, there would be no need for complicated explanations to excuse the quiet. Consider how religions differ around the world. In one culture, people grow up praying to one God. In another, they worship many gods. In others, they follow traditions without gods at all. Each group insists their beliefs are true, but none of them can point to a God that shows up plainly for everyone. What they all share in common is that the gods remain invisible, and the disagreements between religions look exactly like what we'd expect if humans were inventing the stories themselves. The problem of hiddenness becomes sharper when you think about the stakes. Many traditions say that belief is the most important choice a human can make. Some claim eternal reward or eternal punishment depends on it. If the consequences are truly infinite, the silence becomes more troubling. What loving being would hide the information needed to avoid endless suffering? If the stakes are so high, the absence of clarity begins to look cruel. Think of how humans treat important communication. If you want your child to avoid danger, you don't send vague riddles or coded messages. You don't hide behind silence and expect them to piece together your will through cultural guesswork. You make yourself clear, you show up, you shout warnings if you need to, you do everything you can to ensure your child understands. So why would a divine being supposedly infinite in love take the opposite approach? Why rely on ancient writings that contradict each other? Why leave the vast majority of humanity in doubt, confusion, or outright ignorance? And it's not only individuals who suffer from silence, entire societies do. Wars have been fought over conflicting revelations. Communities have been torn apart because each group believed they were following the true God, while the silence gave no resolution. If a God truly cared about peace and clarity, showing up plainly would have prevented centuries of bloodshed. Some apologists argue that God does show up, just not in the way skeptics expect. They point to personal experiences, moments of peace, or sudden feelings during prayer, but those experiences are found in every religion for every kind of God, and even outside of religion entirely. A Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu, and a Buddhist can all report the same kind of inner peace after meditation or prayer, each crediting a different source. The evidence cancels itself out. It tells us more about the human mind than about a divine presence. Psychology offers insight here. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We're wired to find meaning, to connect dots, to feel awe. The same neural mechanisms that make us experience chills at music or a rush of love when we see someone smile can also make us feel as if a higher presence is near. These are powerful experiences, but they don't require anything supernatural. The silence of God is most striking when tragedy hits. After natural disasters, people cry out in prayer for rescue. After shootings or wars, communities gather asking for intervention. Yet, what actually helps in those moments are human actions. Doctors, firefighters, neighbors, aid workers. The silence of heaven is replaced by the noise of human compassion. If anything, this shows that we're the ones who step in when help is needed, not an unseen presence. Theologians sometimes try to turn this into a virtue. They say God works through us, through human action, but that only raises the question, if all the actual help comes from humans, why add God into the picture at all? The silence remains unexplained, the hiddenness untouched. And so the problem of divine hiddenness continues to weigh heavily. It asks us to take the claim of divine love seriously and then compare it to the reality of divine absence. The two don't match. Some defenders of faith suggest that God hides because certainty would make belief too easy. They say that if God's existence were undeniable, people would be forced into obedience, not freely choosing love. But this idea doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Think about your relationships. You don't love your parents, your children, or your friends because you're unsure whether they exist. Their presence is undeniable, yet your love for them is no less genuine. In fact, love thrives when presence is real. If God wanted a world of authentic love, clarity would actually help, not harm. Knowing someone exists doesn't remove your freedom to accept or reject them. We all know celebrities exist, yet we're free to admire them or ignore them. The same logic would apply to a God. If such a being revealed itself plainly, people could still choose to embrace or resist that relationship. Another common response is that God's hiddenness builds character, that faith in the absence of evidence makes people more virtuous. But this assumes that doubt and silence are good teachers. In reality, doubt often breeds confusion, guilt, and even despair. Many former believers describe years of mental torment trying to reconcile silence with promises of love. That suffering doesn't make them stronger, it makes them feel abandoned. If we're honest, it looks less like divine training and more like human psychology wrestling with unmet expectations. There's also the claim that God reveals enough for those who truly seek. But again, the evidence points the other way. Entire populations across history have lived and died without ever hearing about the supposed revelations of one religion. Children raised in different faiths are taught from birth that their traditions are true, yet they grow up equally convinced despite mutually exclusive claims. If God were giving just enough light for honest seekers, why is the religious map of the world divided along cultural and geographic lines? The silence isn't selective, it's universal. It doesn't discriminate between the devout monk, the desperate parent praying for their child, or the skeptic searching for clarity. In all cases, the voice that answers is human, not divine. Think about the role of communication and trust. If someone tells you they love you but never calls, never visits, never writes, never makes any effort to be known, you would question that love. Actions speak louder than words, and in the case of God, there are no words at all, just interpretations, arguments, and traditions passed down by people. This is why divine hiddenness is so powerful as an argument. It doesn't rely on hostility or mockery. It simply compares what we're told to expect, a God of perfect love and care, with what we actually find, long stretches of silence and absence. The gap between those two realities is difficult to bridge. Even within Scripture itself, we see people struggling with hiddenness. The Psalms are filled with cries of, "Why are you silent? Why do you hide your face?" These words show that divine silence is not a new problem. Believers thousands of years ago wrestled with the same absence we see today. The difference is that back then, explanations were easier to invent. Today, with our knowledge of psychology, culture, and history, the silence looks less like mystery and more like a simple lack of presence. Modern believers often describe God's presence as felt in the heart. But that's exactly the kind of language people use for any deep emotion. We feel the presence of lost loved ones and memories. We feel the presence of culture and shared traditions, but feelings are not the same as evidence. They reveal the depth of human imagination, not the certainty of divine reality. And so, the hiddenness of God is not just a small issue. It strikes at the core claim of religion. If love is the essence of God, absence should not define the relationship. Yet, absence is all we see. The problem becomes sharper when we step outside of theology and look at it in ordinary human terms. Suppose someone says they are your closest friend, that they care deeply about your well-being, and that they want to guide your life, but then they never speak to you, never meet you, and never do anything to make their existence known. You would question their sincerity, or more likely, you would doubt they exist at all. The idea of a God of love who hides from view feels just as contradictory. Now, some believers respond by saying, God has revealed himself through nature, the beauty of the stars, the complexity of life, the order of the universe, but nature is not a clear revelation of love. Nature is indifferent. It produces sunsets and earthquakes, flowers and plagues. If nature is God's message, it's a confusing one. For every sunrise that inspires awe, there is a disease that kills without mercy. For every breathtaking mountain, there is a hurricane that wipes out families. The book of nature is not a book of love, but of randomness, danger, and survival. Others say revelation comes through sacred texts. But here again, the evidence is deeply divided. Different religions hold up different books, each claiming divine authority. The Quran, the Bible, the Vedas, the Guru Granth Sahib, all point in different directions with conflicting claims. If God wanted clarity, sacred texts would not be filled with contradictions and cultural fingerprints. They would be unmistakably unified. The fact that every text reflects its time, place, and human author shows that these writings are products of culture, not clear signals from beyond. And then there's the claim that God reveals himself in history, miraculous events, answered prayers, moments of intervention. Yet these stories always seem to fade as we move closer to the present, where documentation and verification are possible. Ancient times are filled with miracles. Modern times, not so much. People still report healings and signs, but none stand up to controlled scrutiny. The miracles of today look exactly like coincidences, exaggerations, or psychological effects. In other words, the hiddenness remains. Think about the most vulnerable people in the world. Children suffering abuse, victims of war, people crying out for deliverance. If ever there were a moment for divine presence, those are the moments. Yet silence is consistent there too. It is not that prayers are sometimes answered and sometimes not. It is that prayers are answered at the same rate as random chance. Whether or not someone survives a tragedy depends on natural factors, not supernatural rescue. Some try to frame this as part of a larger plan, arguing that God's hiddenness has reasons beyond our understanding. But that explanation carries a cost. If the reasons are truly beyond comprehension, then we have no way of knowing whether God is good at all. To say we cannot understand means we cannot know whether hiddenness comes from love or indifference. The very defense undermines the trust it's meant to protect. The more we study history, psychology, and sociology, the clearer the picture becomes. Religion looks like a human creation responding to silence, not a divine voice breaking through it. When people couldn't hear God, they wrote stories of revelation. When they couldn't see God, they built rituals to feel close. When God didn't intervene, they explained it away with mystery. Every attempt to justify the silence points back to the same reality. There was no voice to begin with. This isn't just theory. Real lives are affected by this. Many believers live with constant guilt, worrying that the silence is their fault. They wonder if their faith is too weak, if they are unworthy, if they've somehow pushed God away. But the truth may be simpler. They're not broken, they're just experiencing reality as it is, a reality where silence is not divine absence, but the absence of divinity. The silence of God is sometimes reframed as an invitation to look inward. Believers will say that the hiddenness is a call to discover the divine within ourselves, to listen to conscience or intuition. But if what we're really doing is listening to our own thoughts and feelings, then the concept of God becomes unnecessary. We don't need an external being to explain the inner voice of empathy or the natural pull toward meaning. Psychology explains these features of the human mind far more clearly than theology ever has. When we look at children raised outside of religion, we see that they still develop compassion, curiosity, and a sense of right and wrong. They do this without being told that a hidden God is whispering to them. This suggests that morality is not proof of divine presence, but an evolved feature of human life. Our brains and societies reward cooperation, fairness, and care. These instincts are natural, not supernatural. Consider also how hiddenness is often selective in the stories believers tell. If someone prays and finds peace, they see it as God's presence. If they pray and feel nothing, they're told to wait, to be patient, to trust that God is working invisibly. In other words, every possible outcome is explained in a way that keeps God beyond reach. The silence is reframed not as absence, but as a deeper kind of presence. This is unfalsifiable, and that's the problem. A claim that cannot be tested against reality is no longer a claim about reality at all. In philosophy, this becomes clear through the idea of epistemic responsibility. If a belief requires ignoring evidence, bending definitions, or redefining absence as presence, it loses credibility. The problem of divine hiddenness forces us to ask whether belief in a loving, present God is actually responsible, given the overwhelming absence of clear evidence. Think of it in contrast with human communication again. When someone truly wants to be known, they don't make their presence conditional on interpretation. They don't rely on silence being read as love. They communicate directly, clearly, unmistakably. We expect this in every important relationship: marriage, friendship, parenting. Why would we lower the standard when it comes to a being who supposedly cares more than anyone else could? It's also worth noting how divine hiddenness mirrors the way we see inanimate forces. Gravity doesn't speak, but we infer its existence from direct, measurable effects. If God is hidden but real, we should at least see consistent, testable evidence of divine action. But instead, what we see is nothing beyond what nature and human effort already explain. There's no clear footprint of a being at work behind the curtain. The silence also has cultural consequences. When a society accepts hiddenness as a feature of God, it opens the door to endless interpretation. priests, pastors, and prophets step in to claim they know what the silence really means. This creates power structures built on interpretation rather than evidence. The hiddenness itself becomes the excuse for why people must rely on leaders, texts, and traditions. If God were obvious, those intermediaries would have little power, but in silence they thrive. This is why hiddenness is not just a philosophical puzzle. It is a social and psychological reality that shapes billions of lives. People surrender autonomy, time, and resources to institutions that claim to interpret the silence. The absence of divine clarity becomes the presence of human authority. And so the hiddenness continues, generation after generation, each group trying to explain why God feels absent, each reinterpreting silence as something else. But the simplest explanation remains the same. If a being truly wanted to be known, it would not remain hidden. The silence is not a mystery to be solved. It is evidence to be faced. When people are confronted with divine hiddenness, many turn to personal testimony as the strongest evidence for God's presence. They'll say things like, "I know God is real because I feel Him in my life." But personal testimony is tricky. Our minds are highly suggestible. People in every culture, in every religion, report similar feelings and visions, yet they attribute them to completely different gods or spirits. If these experiences cancel each other out, what remains is not a revelation of divinity, but a revelation of human psychology. This is why psychologists often compare religious experience to dreams. Dreams feel real while we're in them. They can bring joy, fear, or comfort, but their reality vanishes when we wake up. The problem with hiddenness is that the God experience never steps out of the realm of the personal and into the realm of the public. There's no objective, verifiable evidence that everyone can see, and so, like dreams, it stays locked within the mind. Some might argue that God's hiddenness is intentional, that it preserves humility or teaches dependence, but this claim turns hiddenness into a kind of spiritual obstacle course. It assumes that doubt, confusion, and silence are somehow the best ways to cultivate moral growth. Yet, when we look at human development, we see the opposite. Clarity, consistency, and presence are what help people flourish. Children thrive when parents are dependable. Students thrive when teachers are clear. Relationships thrive when trust is based on openness. Hiddenness undermines growth. It doesn't nurture it. Another angle to consider is how hiddenness intersects with global suffering. If God were hidden only to those who were indifferent, maybe it could be defended. But hiddenness persists even in those who cry out most desperately. Victims of abuse, survivors of disasters, children abandoned in poverty, they pray for relief, for comfort, for the smallest sign of care. What they receive instead is silence. For many, that silence deepens trauma. It reinforces feelings of being unloved, forgotten, or cursed. Theological explanations often circle back to the idea of mystery. God's ways are not our ways, but mystery is not an explanation. It's a stopping point, a curtain that covers absence. If a parent abandoned a child and someone tried to justify it by saying, "The parent works in mysterious ways," and we would reject it immediately, love does not need to hide behind riddles. It's also worth noting that divine hiddenness is not just an individual experience. Entire cultures have lived without knowledge of certain gods for millennia. Indigenous communities across continents practiced religions without ever hearing of the Christian or Islamic God. Were these entire populations simply unworthy of revelation, or was divine love selectively hidden from them? If a God wanted universal relationship, selective silence makes no sense. In fact, this cultural distribution of belief looks exactly like what we'd expect if religion were human in origin. The gods people know are the gods of their geography, their history, their culture. Hiddenness, then, is not a puzzle about God's strategy. It is evidence that these gods were never universally present to begin with. So the more we look at it, the clearer the pattern becomes. The silence is not partial, it is universal. The absence is not selective, it is consistent. The explanations are many, but the simplest conclusion is the one most avoid. The silence is exactly what we would expect if there is no divine voice behind it. One of the most striking aspects of divine hiddenness is how it shifts over time depending on human knowledge. In the ancient world, people believed gods directly caused storms, floods, and illness. When they prayed, they thought they were speaking to the forces behind those events. But as science advanced, those explanations faded. Lightning became electricity. Disease became biology. Earthquakes became geology. The gods that once seemed active shrank into the gaps of human ignorance. And in every case, the silence remained. This raises a serious point. If God's hiddenness is simply the result of human misunderstanding, then the trend should go the other way. As we learn more, God's presence should become clearer. Instead, the opposite happens. The more we understand, the less need there is for God. The silence becomes harder to explain, not easier. Believers sometimes counter this by saying that science only explains how things happen, not why they happen. But even if that distinction is granted, it doesn't answer the problem of hiddenness. If God is truly about relationship, then the most important evidence would not be found in abstract whys, but in personal experience. If a being cares about us, the evidence should be relational, not hidden in gaps of explanation. And yet, the people who long most for that relationship often find the silence unbearable. Countless memoirs from former believers describe the same painful journey. They prayed earnestly, served faithfully, studied deeply. They begged for some sign, some response, and were met with silence. For many, that silence eventually broke their faith, not because they hated God, but because they couldn't reconcile love with absence. And consider how this would look in everyday life. If a parent tells their child, "I love you more than anything, but I'm never going to speak to you or show up in any way. You just have to believe I'm there." We would see this as cruelty, not love. And yet, this is the model many are told to accept as divine love. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. There's also the question of fairness. If God remains hidden to some but not to others, then belief becomes a matter of luck. One person feels a powerful religious experience and becomes a lifelong believer. Another prays for decades and feels nothing. If God is supposed to be impartial, the uneven distribution of these experiences looks suspicious. It makes more sense to see them as natural psychological variations rather than divine communication. Sociology supports this view. The experiences people describe as God encounters often align with cultural expectations. A Christian might see Jesus in a vision, while a Hindu might encounter Krishna, and a Buddhist might feel the presence of a bodhisattva. The silence is filled with whatever culture teaches people to expect, which again points to the human mind as the source, not a hidden God. Some defenders of faith argue that God reveals himself through moral law written in the heart, that everyone has an inner compass pointing to the divine. But morality, too, shows clear signs of human origin. Different cultures have practiced very different moral codes throughout history, from human sacrifice to slavery to democracy. Morality shifts with time, circumstance, and social structure. If morality were evidence of a hidden God, it should look universal and unchanging. Instead, it looks cultural and evolving. So we come back again to the silence. Everywhere we look, from history to psychology to sociology, the pattern is the same. People long for a God who never speaks, never shows, never confirms. They interpret silence as presence, but the silence itself remains. One of the subtler aspects of divine hiddenness is how it creates a cycle of expectation and disappointment. People are taught from an early age that prayer will be answered, that God will guide, that a personal relationship is possible. They grow up with stories of miracles and testimonies of lives changed, but when they try it themselves, what they often find is silence. That silence doesn't just challenge their belief, it shakes their sense of self. They wonder if they are the problem, if they lack faith, if they are unworthy. This emotional toll is part of why hiddenness matters. It's not just about intellectual arguments, but about the psychological weight placed on people. A loving God would not leave generations of seekers burdened with guilt for failing to hear a voice that never speaks. The silence turns love into a test. and faith into a struggle. We see this pattern in religious communities all over the world. People testify about answered prayers, but only when the outcome is positive. If a sick person recovers, God is praised. If the sick person dies, it is said to be God's mysterious plan. Either way, the silence is reinterpreted as divine activity, but when studied carefully, the outcomes align with natural probabilities, not supernatural intervention. This selective memory fuels belief, but doesn't resolve hiddenness. It simply reframes absence as presence. It's like listening to static on a radio and insisting that hidden in the noise is a clear message meant just for you. The conviction may feel powerful, but the evidence is not actually there. It also raises the question of sincerity. If God's love is truly unconditional, why would revelation depend on human interpretation, cultural setting, or emotional state? Why would someone raised in a rural village with no access to global religions be left in the dark, while someone in another part of the world hears constant talk of divine presence? A God of love, if real, would not distribute revelation according to geography. Yet that is exactly what we see. Some theologians attempt to solve this by saying that hiddenness is temporary, that God will reveal himself fully after death, but this creates another problem. If the ultimate revelation comes only after life is over, then the entire span of earthly existence, the only existence we can verify, is spent in silence. Why would a loving God withhold presence until it is too late to make choices based on it? If clarity comes only after death, then free will and moral growth in life are based on confusion rather than knowledge. Another attempted solution is the claim that God's hiddenness is actually a form of respect, that by staying hidden, God allows people the space to choose without pressure. But again, this doesn't hold up. Presence does not erase freedom. Knowing that your friends exist doesn't force you to love them. Being aware of your partner's presence doesn't compel loyalty. Awareness simply allows you to make an informed choice. Hiddenness doesn't preserve freedom. It undermines it. It leaves people making the most important supposed decision of their lives without enough information to decide responsibly. So each attempt to explain hiddenness circles back to the same dilemma. Silence does not look like love. Absence does not look like care. Hiddenness does not look like relationship. It looks exactly like the absence of a being who is said to exist but does not actually appear. One way to appreciate the weight of divine hiddenness is to compare it to how other beliefs would be treated if they acted the same way. If someone told you they had a friend who loved you, guided you, and cared for your future, but this friend never spoke, never appeared, and only communicated through other people's interpretations, you would be skeptical. You would assume the friend was imaginary. The silence would be the strongest evidence against the claim. Religious belief, however, often trains people to reverse that logic. Instead of seeing silence as absence, they are taught to see it as mystery or even as proof of God's greatness. The very thing that would normally count as evidence against a claim is reframed as evidence for it. This inversion keeps the belief alive, but it does not solve the problem. Another revealing angle is how hiddenness interacts with time. If God had revealed himself clearly to even one generation of humanity, we would expect that clarity to spread. Yet no such generation exists. Every century has its doubters. Every culture has its skeptics. Every community has people who searched and found nothing. If there were a moment in history where God's presence was undeniable, it would have been preserved. Instead, what we find are stories, texts, and traditions that require interpretation, nothing that removes the need for faith. And that's another clue. The very concept of faith exists only because of hiddenness. We don't need faith to believe in the existence of our families or in the reality of the physical world. We simply experience them. Faith becomes necessary when evidence is lacking. If God were not hidden, faith would not be needed. That the entire religious framework depends on faith is another way of saying it depends on absence. When hiddenness is confronted directly, many believers retreat to personal experience as the last defense. They will say, "I don't care about arguments. I know what I feel," and feelings are powerful, no doubt. but feelings can be wrong. We know this from countless human experiences. People feel certain about dreams, hallucinations, memories that never happened, or intuitions that mislead. Feeling is not the same as knowing. And when feelings are distributed unevenly across cultures, pointing to different gods and traditions, it becomes clear that the source is human, not divine. Another important point is how hiddenness undermines the very idea of divine justice. If eternal destinies depend on belief, and belief depends on encountering evidence of God, then hiddenness creates unfairness. Some people are born into environments where belief is natural and supported. Others are born where belief is foreign or absent. If a loving God values fairness, this unequal distribution of evidence and opportunity makes no sense. Hiddenness makes the stakes not just confusing, but unjust. And when you step back, the picture comes into focus. Hiddenness is not an accessory problem, something minor that can be explained away. It is central. It cuts to the core of what it would mean for a loving God to exist. A being of love would not play a game of hide and seek with those it cares about. The silence of God is not a riddle to solve, it is a truth to confront. One of the most telling features of divine hiddenness is how unevenly people respond to it. Some take silence as a test of endurance, holding on to belief no matter what. Others interpret it as abandonment, walking away from faith entirely, and many hover somewhere in between, unsure of what to make of the quiet. If God's presence were real and clear, we would not see this wide spectrum of reactions, and everyone would at least agree on the basic fact of God's existence. When the disagreements would be about interpretation, not existence itself. Consider how this compares to other universally accepted truths. No one debates whether the sun exists or whether mountains exist. The evidence is direct and undeniable. But with God, the hiddenness makes the very existence of the being the first point of dispute. And that dispute has raged for thousands of years. If a God truly wanted to be known, the debate would have ended long ago. Believers sometimes insist that God does reveal himself, but only to those with the right heart or the right level of faith. This explanation shifts the burden onto the seeker. If you don't experience God, it's your fault, but this is a cruel inversion. It tells sincere people who search and find nothing that their failure is not evidence of absence, but evidence of their own deficiency. Instead of confronting silence honestly, the system blames the individual. This damages countless lives, leaving people burdened with shame for simply seeing reality as it is. We also need to look at how hiddenness has fueled division. When no clear revelation exists, religions fracture. Christianity alone has split into thousands of denominations, each interpreting silence differently. The same is true for other major faiths. Without clarity, interpretation becomes endless and conflict becomes inevitable. Wars, schisms, and persecutions all trace back to the fact that no God appeared to settle the question once and for all. Hiddenness has consequences far beyond individual doubt. It has shaped the violence and politics of entire civilizations. At the personal level, hiddenness can create deep loneliness. People are told they have a personal relationship with God, but for many, that relationship feels one-sided. They pour out prayers, confessions, hopes, and fears, but nothing comes back. It is like speaking into an empty room. Some convince themselves the silence is meaningful. Others cannot. Either way, the reality of the silence remains unchanged. This is why the problem of divine hiddenness is so powerful. It doesn't rest on abstract arguments alone. It connects directly to lived experience. Anyone can understand what it means to long for love and receive only silence. Anyone can see the contradiction between promised relationship and actual absence. And anyone can ask the simple question, if love wants to be known, why hide? The more we examine the issue, the more explanations collapse under their own weight. Mystery, free will, faith, personal growth. None of these justifications fit with the reality of hiddenness. The silence remains stubborn, consistent, universal, and it points to the simplest conclusion: perhaps there is no voice behind it at all. Sometimes, defenders of faith respond to hiddenness by saying that God reveals himself in subtle ways through coincidences, inner nudges, or unexpected moments of clarity. But subtlety is not what we expect from love. When someone truly wants to be known, they don't rely on cryptic signals. They communicate clearly. A partner who only left vague hints instead of speaking directly would not be praised for subtlety. They would be accused of avoidance. If a God's presence is as important as believers claim, then subtle hints are not enough. Others argue that God's hiddenness makes belief more meaningful because belief without certainty is somehow more virtuous, but this raises a troubling question. Why would belief itself be the standard of virtue? Actions, compassion, and integrity seem like far more reliable measures. To elevate belief, especially belief in the absence of evidence, is to reward trust in silence, rather than rewarding genuine care for others. We also see how hiddenness breeds endless apologetics. Entire libraries of theology have been written to explain why God seems absent, but the very need for such explanations is itself evidence. If a God's presence were obvious, people would not need complex intellectual systems to justify the absence. Just as we don't need philosophers to prove the existence of the ocean, we shouldn't need volumes of apologetics to explain the silence of God. It's also worth considering how hiddenness interacts with morality. Believers often say that humans should live good lives to honor God. But if God remains hidden, then morality loses its supposed anchor. What remains is human conscience, cultural norms, and rational reflection. And when we look at how people actually behave, that's what morality looks like in practice. People don't refrain from harming others because a hidden God commands it. They refrain because empathy, social pressure, and shared values make harm unacceptable. In other words, morality functions perfectly well in the absence of revelation, and the silence also creates a paradox. And if God wants belief but hides, then disbelief is not rebellion, it is honesty. To acknowledge absence is not stubbornness, but integrity. Many people who stop believing do so reluctantly after years of searching. They are not rejecting God out of defiance, but out of recognition that the evidence is not there. If God condemns such honesty, then belief becomes less about truth and more about obedience. Some believers take comfort in the idea that hiddenness strengthens faith communities and that silence drives people to rely on each other. And it's true. Communities often fill the gap left by divine absence. But this again points to the human source of comfort. The presence people experience is the presence of one another, not of a hidden God. The very strength of religious communities comes from human support, which shows where the real connection lies. When we step back, we see a consistent picture. Hiddenness shapes personal struggles, fuels theological debates, divides cultures, and empowers institutions. It is not a minor side issue, but the central fact of religious life. Without hiddenness, there would be no faith, no apologetics, no endless debate. The silence is the foundation, and that foundation looks less like love and more like absence. The reality of divine hiddenness becomes even clearer when we look at how people adapt to it. Believers rarely deny that God feels silent. Instead, they reinterpret the silence, and they'll say God is teaching patience or testing trust or working in the unseen ways. But all of these explanations share one feature. They shift the burden away from God and onto the believer. The silence is never allowed to count against the claim. It is always spun as part of the plan. But think about how this looks outside of religion. If a teacher never showed up to class, would we say the silence was a lesson in patience? If a doctor never arrived to treat patients, would we say the absence was part of a mysterious healing method? See, of course not. We would recognize that the silence means the person simply isn't there. When we apply ordinary standards of evidence, divine hiddenness looks exactly like divine absence. This also explains why doubt is often treated as dangerous within religious communities. Doubt is not feared because it's dishonest. Doubt is feared because it faces silence directly. To admit that prayers are not answered, that revelations do not come, that God does not appear, is to confront hiddenness without excuses. And once that happens, belief has little left to stand on. Another layer to this problem is how hiddenness undermines the emotional claims of religion. Believers often speak of God as a source of comfort, a loving presence in times of need. But if comfort comes from imagining presence rather than experiencing it, then the comfort is generated by the human mind. This does not make it worthless, as imagined comfort can still feel real, but it means the source is not external. It is self-created, not divinely given. We also see how hiddenness fuels conflicting claims of truth. Every religion points to experiences of presence, yet they all contradict each other. If hiddenness were part of one true God's plan, it has backfired spectacularly. Instead of uniting people in a relationship with one being, it has fractured humanity into thousands of competing traditions. Hiddenness produces division, not clarity. Some apologists try to explain this by saying that hiddenness allows people to search for God in different ways. But the sheer variety of religions looks less like different paths to the same God and more like different cultures inventing their own answers to silence. The global diversity of belief mirrors the diversity of human imagination, not the plan of a hidden deity. What makes the argument from hiddenness so powerful is its simplicity. It doesn't require special knowledge or advanced philosophy. It asks only, if a God of love exists, why is that God hidden from so many who sincerely seek? The lack of a satisfying answer speaks louder than any defense. And in that silence, many people discover something unexpected. They realize that meaning, morality, and love do not depend on divine presence, that the relationships they longed for with God can be found more honestly in their connections with other people, and that the silence itself may not be a puzzle to solve, but a truth to accept. When all the arguments are laid out, the problem of divine hiddenness points us back to a simple truth. If a being of perfect love exists, it would not remain invisible to those who sincerely seek it. Love does not hide when it longs to be known. Love does not stay silent when a voice is needed. Love does not leave seekers confused, guilty, or abandoned. The silence of God is not just a detail in religious life. It is the defining feature. It explains why faith is necessary, why apologetics are endless, why interpretations differ, and why religions fracture. If God were present, none of this would be needed. But because God is hidden, entire systems have been built to reinterpret absence as presence. We can see this clearly when we remove the special rules often given to religion. In every other part of life, silence signals absence. If a friend never calls, we assume the relationship has ended. If a leader never shows up, we assume they are not leading. If a parent never speaks, we assume they are gone. Only in religion does silence become redefined as evidence of care. And once we notice this double standard, the picture becomes hard to ignore. This doesn't mean that people who believe are foolish. It means they are human. We are wired to seek patterns, to find comfort, to create meaning when none is given. For millennia, silence has been too heavy to bear on its own. So people filled it with stories, rituals, and hopes. Those traditions gave them strength. But strength born of imagination is not the same as strength born of reality. And perhaps that's where the real lesson lies. The absence of God does not mean the absence of love. It means love comes from us, from the people who show up, who speak, who act, who care. When tragedy strikes, it is human compassion that answers. When loneliness bites, it is human connection that heals. When we long for meaning, it is human creativity that provides it. The silence of God leaves space for the voices of humanity. The problem of divine hiddenness, then, is not just a critique of religion. It is a reminder of where presence truly comes from. It comes from us, from each other, from the real and tangible bonds we build. And in that recognition, the silence becomes less frightening because it no longer represents abandonment. It represents clarity. The world may be without divine voices, but it is not without voices that matter. The absence of God does not erase meaning. It reveals where meaning has always been. In the hands we hold, the words we share, the lives we shape. And when we stop waiting for a voice that never speaks, we can finally hear the ones that always have our own and each other's